There's no doubt that Disneyland is a successful theme park now, but how it got that way wasn't always an easy road. The park we know and love was built on a million mistakes and failures, both big and small. In this new series, we'll be exploring some of the ways the Imagineers had to pivot, reassess, change, and sometimes, yes, even fail in order to make the happiest place on Earth. And along the way, we may just find a little bit of ourselves in these stories as well. Today we're going to head to Disneyland's Fantasyland and hop aboard the classic Disney ride of Storybookland Canal Boats, or the Canal Boats of the World as it was known when it opened in 1955. There simply hadn't been enough money or time to finish this attraction well before the park's opening. And it was so bad that cast members actively discouraged guests from using their tickets for the ride. On opening day of Disneyland in 1955, Disneyland advertising manager Jack Lindquist put his son David on the boat ride by himself, expecting to see him at the exit in a handful of minutes. But it wasn't until 45 minutes later that Jack saw his son's boat again, being towed through the water by 4 cast members wearing waders. The engine had overheated, sadly a common occurrence for the little boat ride that had all the charm of a dusty construction site. In short, the ride was a massive fail. Knowing something had to change, Canal Boats of the World underwent a significant makeover and reopened in 1956 full of delightful landscaping and charming miniatures based on classic storybook tales and Disney films. Disney had learned from their mudbank blunder and redeemed the darling little boat ride. But achieving the picturesque landscaping of Storybookland Canal Boats was not without its challenges. Take, for instance, the Old Mill section. This was modeled after the first silly symphony ever created that used the multiplane camera to achieve 3D effects, a training ground for the new technology before they used it for their first ever full-length feature animation of Snow White. As the story of the Old Mill was set in a European country like the Netherlands, Walt Disney suggested that tulips be planted in front of the windmills. The Imagineers hired a horticulturist to help them locate miniature tulips that would fit the scale of the miniature windmills, and eventually they found a variety in New Zealand that would fit the bill. The only problem was that the plants had 18-inch stems, which meant the stems were too long and had to be buried and hidden for the miniature plants to be in scale with the rest of the miniature buildings. If anyone knows anything about basic horticulture, burying a plant like this is not a win. The tulips simply couldn't be kept alive, so they were eventually removed. The Imagineers at WED also had a creative solution to making Ratty's house near Toad Hall look like it was by a terribly tortured old snag from The Wind in the Willows. According to Marty Sklar, they uprooted a 100-year-old grapevine and turned it upside down, and for many years it was a convincing scene. But eventually the grapevine didn't like being forced into such a predicament, so it was replaced by a fake stump instead. Both Ratty's and Toad Hall were eventually relocated when the Sultan's Palace moved in, but not before someone spelled moly wrong on this sign. Another canal boat failure involved the iconic Monstro the Whale. In most of Bruce Bushman's early concept art for Fantasyland, Monstro was featured as a flume ride where boats would fly out of Monstro's mouth. But in the Storybookland interpretation, you go into his mouth to enter the world of miniatures at a slow, sedate pace. When people asked Walt Disney why the ride went through Monstro's mouth, he said that he paid so much money to build that whale that they were going to make sure that the guests had a good hard look at it. The failure, however, came in with Monstro spouting water out of its blowhole at the top. One day, Walt was strolling through Fantasyland and noticed that Monstro wasn't spouting. When he asked why the effect was turned off, the cast members replied that guests on the Casey Jr. circus train above were complaining about getting wet as they rode by the spouting whale. Walt was furious and insisted they turn the effect back on. They did, but this was obviously not a win for the guests. To fix this irritation, WED Imagineering eventually extended this tunnel to cover more of the tracks, protecting guests from the spray while preserving Monstro's spout. The miniatures themselves had their own smaller fails during the creation process. Harriet Burns, the first female Imagineer at WED, was working on assembling real stained glass windows for the little church in the Alice in Wonderland scene. After she had meticulously placed over 360 lead glass pieces by hand, it was time to go home, so she left them on her workbench and called it a day. Well, Walt Disney was known to go into WED's workshop and play with whatever he could find. This was, by the way, something he had always done at the studio for animation, sometimes digging through discarded sketches and trash cans, smoothing out the wrinkled, discarded paper, and putting it back on the animator's desk, often with a note saying something like, "Use this one." Anyway, back to the workshop, because on this particular day, Walt stopped by Harriet's workbench and had a closer look at what she was creating, miniatures being a passion of his own. Charmed by Harriet's glasswork, Walt lifted the window presumably to hold it up to the light, and it was only then that he realized they were not soldered together as all 360 pieces fell to the floor. The Imagineers at WED learned, though, And from then on out, they always made sure their work was glued down, secured, or hidden at the end of the day if it wasn't ready for inspection by Walt. The last story is not so much a failure, but a redirection in design. And it all has to do with this quilted succulent section that today's cast members will tell you is from the 1933 Silly Symphony Lullaby Land. Or perhaps they attribute the small size of the plants to the magical pixie dust of Tinkerbell. But that's not why this quilt exists. Because once upon a time in this ride's development, a giant laid under this quilt, with his head on one side and his feet sticking out of the other. He never made it into the final attraction, however, because he was deemed out of place with the rest of the miniatures. So the giant was cancelled, but the quilt remained. They simply changed the story, and that's why you hear the spiel that you do today. There's no doubt that Storybookland Canal Boats has had its share of blunders along the way to becoming an iconic attraction in Disneyland's Fantasyland. It has stood the test of time, even when Walt believed it was only temporary, saying that, eventually, they would tear down the little boat ride and put something bigger in its place. Despite the ride's troublesome vegetation, or lack thereof, boats that wouldn't move, banks with too much mud, and whales that wet unsuspecting guests, this beautiful little slice of peace and joy has found its way to charming imperfection in the end. It's a story woven not only of the tales we hold so dear, but of trials, mistakes, and failures that forced the Imagineers to get creative instead of giving up. They built tunnels instead of turning off spouts. They reassembled shards of glass when they'd been ruined and scattered. They replaced tulips and grapevines when they failed to thrive. They acknowledged their mistakes, but chose to fail forward and learn from them rather than shut down and quit. And so we, too, can do the same. If something as beautiful and perfect as the Storybookland Canal Boats could have so many flaws and failures along the way, perhaps it's telling us a greater story, that our worst mistakes could become our greatest triumphs if we simply don't give up. Thank you for coming along with me today as we floated through the not-so-perfect history of the Storybookland Canal Boats. If you enjoyed this meander through some obscure Disney history, I hope you'll stick around and subscribe. I've also written several books incorporating Disney history into storytelling if you'd like to read more, all of which are available at Amazon.com.